Hi, welcome to my channel, I Died Near-Death Experiences, where we will talk about near-death experiences, the paranormal, things that we've seen or heard that maybe you haven't been brave enough to share with anyone yet. But this is the place to do it. This is the place to listen, it's a place to share, no judging. So, come closer. Grab a cup of tea. And let me take you back to the first time that I died. I was about 15 years old and had traveled to Lake Hartwell, Georgia with my mother, who was a widow, and her best friend and their 18-year-old son, who I was kind of seeing. And we were cutting up like teenagers do, and screaming and yelling and running and chasing each other, roughhousing. And Larry was chasing me down the dock that went out into one of the inlets on Lake Hartwell where fishermen will sit and fish and or tie their little boats up to. When I reached the end of the dock faster than I thought I would, slipped and fell into the water. And as I hit the water, I went, oh! The only problem is I was already under the waves. And I felt the cool lake water get sucked into my lungs. And I struggled a little bit thinking, I gotta get to the surface. I'm drowning. And I looked up, and Lake Hartwell is kind of a murky, yellowish water in these inlets. It's in the deep south, where the red clay tints the water, so you can't really see through it. And I looked up, and I struggled maybe 10 seconds. And this feeling of utter peace, I mean, peace, tranquility, came over me. And I looked up, and I could see the sunlight filtering down through the water in kind of a cascading light with little flickering stars in it, which was probably sediment. A fish swam by. And I looked up, and I heard a voice saying, "Not yet." Hands came down through the water. I see them emerge in the water, and they came down. Next thing I know, I'm being pulled up, laid across the dock, and my chest and back being pounded on. And that was the worst pain I had ever suffered in my young life, with the feeling of the water being pumped out of your lungs. And I coughed so hard, I almost broke a rib, almost sprained my rib muscles. Ringing in my ears was absolutely intense. We call it ringing, but it sounded more like trumpets. And I heard the voice again in my head, "Not yet. It's not time." And that, my friends, was my first experience with a near-death. Now, I went on later to study psychology, and I took some classes in paranormal activity, and actually put a name to the experience of being under the water and drowning and getting that euphoric feeling of comfort and warmth and peace They call it the dolphin effect. And if you want to look that up, the dolphin effect in drowning. And look at other people's stories. Maybe I should read a few to you. I am going to read these to you because I can't hold all these in my head. But come closer. There are a number of stories online that you can look up for near-death drowning experiences. And I just pulled a couple of them for you. If you've had your own drowning experience, please share and we can talk about it. It can be extremely terrifying. Some of the after effects are extreme PTSD, anxiety, depression, feelings of guilt. It could be extremely traumatic, but it wasn't traumatic for me. It was peaceful and has been a part of my contemplative character ever since. Where I play it over and over in my head and see what something new I can learn from it. And it certainly has opened the doors to having an open mind and hearing people out. So let's go to our first story. Wet Lettuce 42 wrote this about, I guess, 15 years ago, maybe. And Wet Lettuce says, "It was something stupid I did. I thought a slide would lead me to shallow ends of the swimming pool, but it turned out to be a spiral that dumped me into the deep end of the pool. And they tried to swim to the top, but with their hands up, they just kept sinking. Down, down, down to the bottom of the pool." And she's saying that they felt that their life flashed before their eyes. Now, with my experiences, that didn't happen. But everyone can be a little bit different. Heck, I was only, 14? I don't think I was even 15 years old when my near drowning happened. But they're saying that their life flashed before their eyes. All their memories came flooding back before they felt themselves being pulled out of the water. Their side effects is they were ill for a week with the water in their lungs, and that their friends laugh about it, but it wasn't a funny moment. So they take it with great seriousness, and obviously it was traumatizing. Now, I will have to say one of the side effects I had was a lung infection. And when you suck water into your lungs, it can cause, with all the fish poop and whatever else is in the water, it can cause all sorts of infections and lifelong breathing problems, bronchitis, and that type of thing, which I have now. And if you go to my other channel, which is Our Georgia's Suburban Homestead, in some of my videos you can hear me having trouble breathing or being out of breath, and it's probably as a result of this experience. But I digress. No Platypus. This also was written 2 years ago. Says, "A classmate nearly drowned me by accident during a final swimming test at school. It was very scary and very disorienting. And they felt like a lot more time had passed than actually had." Now, if you remember back to my story when I talked about seeing the filtered light and noticing the light dancing in the particles in the water, it was very tranquil, very peaceful, very calming. And I don't know how long I was under the water, but I was under long enough to have all those thoughts and to notice the fish swimming by, how pretty the light was, and how maybe I could just stay there. And then that voice came and said, "Not yet." Now, the voice I heard wasn't of my friends. It's a voice that I would hear later on in life with my other experiences. But not yet, Lisa. Not yet. So this person was pulled out of the water and says that if almost dying wasn't enough, they failed the test due to not being able to complete it. What kind of a teacher does that to a kid? Blue 64 also sharing their experience of 2 years ago. Again, in school or with a swimming teacher, who had, when they were 4 years old, someone had taught them how to hold their breath. And the teacher had taken them to the deep end of the pool, told them to hold their breath and dunked them in the water repeatedly, which, you know, what kind of a teacher does that? That's torture. And it says they ended up with a deeply ingrained fear of water. Fear doesn't help you. If you're afraid in any life-threatening situation, fear doesn't help you. It actually can make things worse. So here's this poor person, traumatized as a child by their swimming teacher. But when they became a teenager, they would go camping in the woods, and one night they were caught in a flash flood. Now, they don't share with us where they were, okay? But they say they were effing terrified, and they were sure they were going to die. And luckily, two of these person's friends were lifeguards, and they remember them pulling them through the flood, telling me if I didn't quit struggling, that he was going to knock my butt out. So, okay, they're in the mountains of Arizona, so they don't swim anymore. That's sad. Summon the Corian says that they went to a water park and had a near drowning after coming down the water slide, where the water was pushed into their windpipe with such force they had a laryngeal spasm. You spasm down. They couldn't speak, they couldn't inhale, and they went into a panic. No one noticed. They started to black out, and just when they were telling themselves to get to the edge of the pool, they started to feel that feeling I had. They felt peaceful, they felt calm. They saw all the lifeguards on their phones and looked around and saw others, and it felt like a peaceful observation of life and what was happening around them. Kind of like me and the fish. They had an overwhelming feeling to just lay down and fall asleep and feel the peace. They were trying to get air, but it felt like breathing through a straw, and their friends noticed their distress and pulled them out of the pool. They laid on the side of the pool and coughed for a long time, and I already told you how painful that is, expelling the water from your lungs. It's really not fun. And they ended up going to the ER. But because it was a pool, they suffered chlorine burn in their lungs and a bacterial infection and aspiration pneumonia. Whether I suffered pneumonia or not, I did get pneumonia several times during my life, but it was the 70s, and I guess they didn't really watch me much after giving me antibiotics. But the result of their experience was to avoid water in water parks. And they were sick for several weeks, they're saying. Now I'm going to take you along a journey of a psychologist that experienced near drowning and went on to later treat people who shared the experience. If you're wondering, I'm drinking rose tulsi tea. It smells like roses. It's wonderful. This person is over in England, over in the UK. And they're saying on this particular day they would have been very happy not to have gone into the Atlantic at all. And that at this point the water is very rough and it's not as smooth as what they're used to in East Sussex. That on the first morning on this vacation that he had put on a wetsuit and went body surfing and really enjoyed his experience body surfing. And on their last day there, he decided, well, as the sun was setting, that he would go ahead and have one last swim. And he went into the water alone, okay? And this is seawater, and drowning in seawater can be very different and has more health implications. We'll talk about that in a minute. He tells us, as the light began to fade, he felt compelled to have one last dip before he headed home. The waves had become choppier and the afternoon passed into evening. You could see the little white frothy tips on the waves as they rolled into shore. Kind of like a foreboding, I would think. He plunged into the water and struck out, confident at first, realizing his mistake when he got out really deep. Once he realized that maybe he had made the wrong decision, he felt the surf dragging his legs. Okay? It's like the water was attacking him, dragging his legs, hauling him down to the rocks that were just hidden just below the surface, and it was skinning up his knees and making him bleed, and his elbows got banged up and bleeding, and he was trying desperately to fight his way back to the beach. He said about that time that a great wave sucked me down and towards it, and then it broke across him like he was a sack of gravel, bouncing him along the seabed. He was desperate for air. He was churned around until he no longer knew up from down. The current relaxed its grip and up he went, just in time for the next big wave to break over his head and push him back down. You imagine the panic and the fear. This is cold water off the coast of England. Totally in control. You have no control over your body, tumbling arse over tea kettle through the waves, being bounced off the rocks, not knowing up from down. Each time he surfaced, the process repeated itself until he was battered and winded and still out of his depth. He swallowed water, tried not to breathe it in, waved frantically at the party at the beach who were packing up their stuff, and they waved back. From their perspective, it probably looked like he was having a good time. Diving into the waves, waving, but certainly not drowning, right? Then it struck him. He was about to drown and nobody knew. And he experienced the most acute sense of loneliness and isolation as in no other time during his life, as another wave thrust him down. In that moment, he was tempted to just relax, like I was, to just succumb. He says in his line of work, he had interviewed lots of people who had been in near-death situations, so we know that he's in psychiatry, a psychologist of some kind. Some had mentioned fear and panic, others a sense of resignation, like I did. He just felt overwhelmed, helpless, and undignified. Like a sock in a washing machine. That's a pretty good analogy. with what he was through, in the ocean. Rather than fear, he experienced sadness. It's all very well doing something you enjoy, he says, but this had been the last enjoyable swim of his life. As he struggled, an intense pain bloomed in his chest, spreading downwards and inwards. That's my lungs giving out, he thought, or my heart. Back on the surface, he tried to wave again, but couldn't even lift his arm. The pain had become intolerable. And when he was able to breathe, it only made his pain worse. Kind of like me. When they pumped that water out of my lungs, it was extremely painful. It hurt to breathe. I didn't want to breathe. The next wave drove him toward the shore, and finally his feet found purchase on the beach bottom. And he stumbled forward, his right arm dangling at his side. His brother-in-law finally realized something was up and went to help him, right? And he says, "You've dislocated your shoulder." That was the battering he must have taken against the rocks in the bottom of the seafloor. So as he sat on the beach, wrapped in a towel, shivering, someone brought him some coffee. He said he had realized, as his breathing became increasingly difficult, that he had escaped the sea, but now felt like he was drowning on land. And you may want to look up dry land drowning for a description of what happens to your body and your lungs after you inhale seawater. So if you've ever been splashing around, if you're out splashing around at the beach and you mistakenly inhale just a little bit of seawater and you cough it out and hack for a while, but then go on into back to the house or whatever, please know that the danger is not over, because there's something called dry land drowning, where the salts in the seawaters do irreparable damage to you and can actually kill you. So that's something maybe you can take away from this storytelling, and if you are a beachgoer. So take any inhalation of seawater very seriously, even if it's just a brief thing when you've expelled it. Okay. The results of this physician's or this psychologist's near-death experience was an incurable fear of the water. He doesn't go to the water anymore. And he says even small waves fill him with apprehension. So it did damage to his psyche. And he says now he only swims in pools and he sticks with the breaststroke. I think that is an interesting account of that person's experience, and given that he is in the mental health profession, that he can't get himself past the fear. I love to swim. I went on to be a competitive swimmer for a little bit in middle school. My husband was into diving and was a marine biology major, one of his many things that he studied at college. And we'd go snorkeling a lot. He even got me to get PADI certified for scuba diving. My apprehension in the water is being in the water with things that look at me and they see dinner. But we digress. The final thing I wanted to share, the final story I want to share with you, is of a young boy, an Eagle Scout, who is from Illinois. And he wrote this in 2020, so this is fairly recent, a recent experience for him. And he was not a trained swimmer, he was a self-taught swimmer. And like teenagers, bringing this full circle to my story of when I was a teenager, we're not very cautious at that age. Can you remember back to your teenage years and what kind of reckless things did you do. But he and his friend decided they were going to swim across this lake in Illinois to an island. And his friend was a trained swimmer. And they both went running down the beach, and they dove in, and off they went. Off across the water. Now, you've got to keep in mind, when you look across water at islands or objects, they seem closer than they really are. And that's why a lot of people who set off to swim from one point to another, not realizing that they're not, what was their, Naiad, the person who swam from Cuba to Florida, they're not her. Okay, so these two Eagle Scouts dive into the water, and they're swimming toward this island. And this kid's slapping the water with his arms and kicking with his legs because he's not trained for distance swimming. And those of us who are trained swimmers know that that takes too much energy. You don't do that. And pretty soon he became fatigued, and to the point where his upper body just was shaking. His arms and legs turned into rubber bands, and he couldn't make any more progress. He was just weak. His body was giving out on him. And he's looking ahead, and it suddenly occurs to him in that moment that there's no way he's going to reach this island. And he looks behind me and he looks behind himself and realizes he's not making it back to shore either. He says to himself, I'm in a lot of trouble. He looks to his right, he looks to his left, and several yards he can see some rocks. Bless you. Sticking out of the lake, so he beelines it for that, right? So instead of heading toward the shore, one or the other, he heads toward these rocks. At some point he got water in his nose and he was smelling the lake. So the lake water obviously wasn't very clean. He could smell it in his sinuses after inhaling through his nose a little bit, and he can taste it. And then it gets in his ear, and his ears are popping. And it was all he could do to reach those rocks. And when he finally put his hand out to put it on that rock, he grabs the rock and it sinks. It's not a rock. It's a piece of wood bobbing in the waves about like he is, and down it goes. Well, then he got the thought, well, maybe I could stand on it and it would push him up and give him a chance to rest. When he stood on it, pushed down, stood on it, he sunk, boom, down under the waves. 15 feet of water. And he struggled for a little while, and then he got a feeling of peace. It's that peaceful dolphin effect again. And he goes down and down and down. By this time, his friend Tom is circling, looking for him, yelling. And he pops back up out of the water. The silence of being under the water, the peacefulness of being under the water. And he hears Tom yelling. And what he thinks is, it's pretty darn loud out here. So the sounds of the world were an assault on his ears at that point. If you're wondering what I'm looking at. Ow! Sorry for the interruption. So he goes down again after hearing sounds assaulting his ears. And he feels something cold on the back of his head, and he realizes that it's his head hitting the mud on the floor of the lake. And he realizes that the water is dark. It's just darkness around him, and that there's a light up high. And that must be up, and he's out of air. And he says to himself, I'm going to have to take a breath. Now that didn't occur to me. Remember, I saw the light. I was enjoying the lemon yellow light coming through the kind of red clay murkiness of Lake Hartwell, Georgia. And I was enjoying that experience and watching the little fish flow, swim. But not this guy. He realizes that out of the darkness, that bit of light he's seeing must be the way up, and he's got to get air. He feels compelled to get air. So he put his foot against something hard at the bottom of the lake and pushed off. Everything he had, he pushed off. He struggled, he pushed, he reached for the light. And as he's coming up and opening his mouth, getting ready for that breath he so desperately needs, he breaks the surface, and as he goes to inhale and draw in that air, and he's coughing, and somehow he rolls over on his back. Tom swims up beside him. In the next 15 minutes, he slowly was dragged back to shore. And he's helping by stroking a little bit in the water with his hands, but he's very weak. But then he makes it to shore. He doesn't go on to say whether this has traumatized him or not, but I think what we can take from his story is there are a lot of similarities to mine. He did result in a new respect for the ocean for water. He didn't say whether he was afraid of water. I'm not afraid of water. The psychologist is afraid of water. The people who almost drowned in the pool are traumatized and afraid of water. So, what do you all think? Would you be afraid? Are you afraid of water? Would an experience like this make you afraid of water? Do you think we can predict how we're going to react to these situations? So that's our first story. It's our first sharing of a story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope we'll be back, and I'll share the big story somewhere down the road, and we'll talk about all sorts of other things. So thanks for attending. Going into the new year, I hope everyone has a safe and happy New Year's celebration in just a few nights. So until next time, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of the light.